No one at the Washington County Johnson City Animal Shelter had ever seen a dog like Roscoe. The big German shepherd just sat there day after day, his eyes vacant pools of amber that seemed to stare straight through you. For 6 long months he'd taken their food with gentle politeness, allowed their veterinary care without complaint, and retreated to his corner without a single tail wag or sign of joy. "It's like he's just existing," Tammy Davis, the shelter director, whispered to her colleague. "He doesn't fear us, doesn't love us. It's as if he's waiting for something none of us can give him." They'd tried everything. Treats, toys, gentle coaxing, even bringing in dog behaviorists. Nothing penetrated the invisible wall Roscoe had built around himself. That's why nobody was prepared for what happened that Tuesday morning when the shelter door opened and a thin, middle-aged man walked in. Roscoe's head snapped up, his ears suddenly alert. A sound, part whine, part cry, escaped his throat. And then, before anyone could react, tears began streaming from those once empty eyes. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The Marshall family's modest farmhouse sat on 15 acres of rolling Tennessee countryside, the kind of place where fireflies danced on summer evenings and morning fog nestled in the valleys like a blanket. Robert and Linda Marshall hadn't planned on adding a dog to their family that spring day 4 years ago, but fate had other plans when Robert's brother, a local veterinarian, called about a raid on an illegal breeding operation. "They found a litter half-starved," he'd told Robert. "Most are spoken for, but there's one little guy nobody wants. He's the runt. Probably won't make it through the week." That runt, a German shepherd pup so small he fit in Robert's palm, had defied all expectations. Despite his rough start, he grew into a handsome dog with intelligent eyes and a distinctive white patch on his chest shaped vaguely like a star. The name Runt stuck, though it became increasingly ironic as he matured into a powerful 90-pound animal with a noble bearing. But it was Runt's relationship with 13-year-old Ethan that transformed both their lives. After the tractor accident that took his grandfather's life 2 years before, Ethan had stopped speaking entirely. Doctors called it selective mutism, brought on by trauma. For months, the once talkative boy communicated only through nods and written notes. Then came Runt. Something about the vulnerable puppy broke through Ethan's silence. Linda would never forget the afternoon she heard her son's voice for the first time in 6 months. A whispered, "Come here, boy," as he coaxed the puppy onto his lap. From that day forward, Ethan spoke to Runt, and gradually to his family again. 8-year-old Emma adored Runt, too, dressing him in ridiculous costumes that he endured with dignified patience. But everyone knew Runt was Ethan's dog. They shared a bond that went beyond words, a mutual healing that had saved them both. Each evening, without fail, Runt would position himself on the eastern corner of the porch at precisely 6:15, watching the long gravel driveway for Ethan's return from after-school activities. It became such a reliable habit that Linda often checked the time by Runt's movements rather than her watch. No one imagined that these ordinary days of happiness would ever end, until they did. Suddenly and without warning, the day Runt disappeared began like any other spring morning on the Marshall farm. The air was sweet with the scent of wild honeysuckle, and birds called to one another from the old oak trees that lined the property. Robert was fixing a fence in the north pasture while Linda hung laundry on the line, the white sheets billowing like sails in the gentle breeze. Emma had set up a tea party for her dolls under the shade of the apple tree, and Ethan was working on his science project on the back porch. Runt, dozing contentedly at his feet. "Mom, Dad, come quick!" Emma's shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning. "There's a fox with babies!" The entire family hurried toward Emma's voice, even Runt, who bounded ahead, always eager to investigate any excitement. At the edge of the woods that bordered the eastern side of their property, a red fox stood frozen, watching them warily. Behind her, 3 tiny kits tumbled and played, unaware of the humans watching. "Stay back," Robert cautioned, holding up his hand. "Mama Fox might get scared if we get too close." For several minutes they watched the little family, enchanted by the rare sighting. Then suddenly a loud truck backfired on the distant county road. The mother fox startled and darted into the underbrush, her baby scrambling after her, and before anyone could grab his collar, Runt took off after them, disappearing into the dense woods. "Runt, come back, boy," Ethan called. But the German shepherd was already out of sight, his powerful body vanishing among the trees with remarkable speed. "He'll be back soon," Robert reassured the children. "He's just curious. He knows not to go far." But as morning stretched into afternoon and afternoon into evening, Runt did not return. Robert walked the property boundary, calling his name. Ethan and Linda took the truck and drove slowly down all the neighboring roads, stopping to ask everyone they met if they'd seen a German shepherd. Emma stayed home, sitting vigilantly on the porch, certain her furry friend would appear at any moment. By nightfall, a cold knot of fear had formed in all their stomachs. This wasn't like Runt. He had never wandered before, never shown any interest in leaving the farm that had been his home since puppyhood. "Maybe he got confused chasing the fox," Linda suggested as she made up sandwiches nobody felt like eating. "He might have lost our scent." That night Robert left the porch light on and the back door slightly ajar just in case. Ethan barely slept, getting up every hour to check if Runt had returned. By morning, the dog's empty bed in the corner of Ethan's room was an accusation, a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. The search intensified over the following days. The marshals printed flyers with Runt's picture and tacked them to telephone poles and community bulletin boards throughout the county. Robert and his friends formed search parties, combing the woods and fields within miles of their home. Linda called every veterinary office and animal shelter within a 50-mile radius. Ethan's school principal even made an announcement asking all students to keep an eye out for the missing dog. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The forest surrounding their property was vast, connected to thousands of acres of wilderness. There were coyotes in those woods, and occasionally even bears. The thought that Runt might have fallen victim to a predator or gotten trapped somewhere was almost unbearable, but increasingly difficult to ignore. The most heartbreaking change was in Ethan. As Runt's absence stretched longer, the boy spoke less and less. By the 1-month mark, he had retreated back into silence, communicating only when absolutely necessary, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for a silhouette that never appeared. It was as if losing Runt had reopened the wound of his grandfather's death, reminding him that those you love can disappear in an instant. "We can get another dog," Linda suggested gently one evening, unable to bear her son's silent suffering any longer. Ethan's response was to get up from the dinner table and walk out of the room, the first tears they'd seen him shed since the disappearance finally falling down his cheeks. They kept the flyers up long after they were faded and tattered by rain. Robert still walked the property line every evening, calling Runt's name into the gathering darkness. Linda found herself setting aside scraps at dinner, momentarily forgetting there was no dog to feed them to. Emma would sometimes sit at the eastern corner of the porch at 6:15, where Runt used to keep his faithful watch, as if she could summon him back through sheer force of will. But as the seasons changed, spring to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, and back to spring again, they had to accept the painful truth. Runt was gone. Whatever had happened that day in the woods, their beloved dog was not coming home. What the Marshall family couldn't know was that Runt's desperate attempts to find his way home had been thwarted by both distance and misfortune. The Fox family had led him deep into unfamiliar territory, much farther than he had ever ventured before. By the time he lost their trail, the forest had grown dense and unfamiliar, the scents confusing and overlapping. He had tried to backtrack, following his own scent, but a sudden spring downpour had washed away any trace he might have followed. For 3 days, Runt wandered the woods, growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing hour. His instincts were good, but he was a farm dog, not a wild animal. When he finally emerged from the forest, he found himself not on the familiar land of the Marshall farm, but on the outskirts of a rural area he had never seen before. It was there that Runt's journey took its darkest turn. Exhausted and hungry, he approached a ramshackle house seeking help, drawn by the smell of cooking meat. Instead of kindness, he found cruelty. The men who lived there recognized a valuable animal when they saw one. A purebred German shepherd, clearly well-trained, would fetch a good price in certain circles. Runt was captured, a heavy chain fastened around his neck, and thrown into a makeshift kennel behind the house. Over the coming weeks, he discovered he wasn't alone. Other dogs were kept there too, some bearing the scars of fighting, others still fresh and terrified like him. The men were running a dog-fighting operation, using some dogs as fighters and others as bait to train them. The cruelty Runt witnessed in those days changed him. The loyal, gentle dog who had never shown aggression found himself in a place where violence was the currency of survival. But even here, some essential quality in his spirit remained unbroken. When forced to face other dogs in practice sessions, he would refuse to fight, taking punishment rather than inflicting it. This stubborn dignity earned him no favors with his captors, who soon designated him as bait rather than fighter material. It might have been the end of Runt's story if not for a stroke of luck. During a particularly chaotic training session, a fight broke out between two of the most aggressive dogs. In the confusion that followed, a gate was left unlatched. Runt, ever observant, seized his moment. With the last reserves of his strength, he slipped through the gate and ran as he had never run before, the sounds of shouting men fading behind him. Freedom came at a cost. Runt was miles from home, injured, and now deeply distrustful of humans. He carried not only the physical wounds of his captivity, a torn ear, a deep gash along his flank that would never fully heal, but the invisible scars of trauma. The once friendly farm dog now viewed every human approach with suspicion, every outstretched hand as a potential threat. For weeks he lived as a stray, foraging in garbage cans and hunting small rodents when he could catch them. He tried repeatedly to find his way back to the farm, using the position of the sun as his guide. But each attempt led him to unfamiliar roads or brought him back to the same town where he had first been captured. The distance, nearly 10 miles as the crow flies, but much longer by any safe route a dog could travel, proved insurmountable. Eventually, Runt established a tenuous existence in a commercial district about 16 kilometers from the Marshall farm. It was a place with enough restaurants and dumpsters to provide reliable food sources, but not so populated that animal control was a constant threat. He became a known fixture in the area, the homeless German shepherd who accepted food but allowed no one close. Among those who noticed him was Sarah Thompson, a woman in her 50s who managed a small boutique in the district. Something in the dignified way the dog carried himself, even in homelessness, touched her heart. She began leaving food and water out for him behind her shop, gradually establishing a routine. Each morning she would put out fresh supplies, and each evening she would find the dishes empty. Sometimes, when she was closing up shop, she would catch a glimpse of him watching from a distance, his amber eyes reflecting the street lights. "You remind me of someone," Sarah told him one evening, standing at a respectful distance as he approached the food she'd left. "There was a dog just like you at my old neighborhood before I moved to town. He belonged to a family with 2 kids. Good people." Runt paused, something in her voice or scent momentarily familiar, but the connection was too fragile, the memory too distant. He took the food and retreated to his safe spot beneath an abandoned loading dock. For almost 2 years, this was Runt's life, a ghost dog surviving on the kindness of strangers but unable to trust enough to come in from the cold. He developed a routine of sorts, making rounds between various businesses where people left him food, avoiding the busiest streets and the occasional animal control officer who might be called about a stray. During this time, he had opportunities to be caught and perhaps reunited with his family, Several well-meaning people tried to approach him with leashes or even called animal services, but the trauma of his captivity had taught him to evade such attempts at all costs. At the first sign of capture, he would disappear for days, only resurfacing when hunger drove him back to his established territory. Sarah continued to be his most consistent benefactor, and over time a fragile trust developed between them. She never tried to touch him or confine him, and eventually he would eat while she sat quietly nearby. Had things continued this way, perhaps Runt might have eventually allowed himself to be helped. But, as with so many things in the spring of 2020, everything was about to change. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived like a slow-moving storm, transforming the once buzzy commercial district into a ghost town. Businesses closed their doors, people stayed home, and suddenly the precarious network of support that had kept Runt alive began to unravel. No open restaurants meant no discarded food. No workers meant no kind-hearted people leaving out bowls of kibble. For the first time since escaping his captors, Runt faced the real possibility of starvation, and Sarah Thompson, watching from her now-closed boutique, knew something would have to be done. Sarah Thompson had never considered herself a particularly sentimental woman. At 58, with a divorce and a lifetime of hard-won independence behind her, she prided herself on practicality above all else. But there was something about the German Shepherd that had melted a corner of her heart normally reserved for her grandchildren and the occasional good bourbon. As the pandemic shuttered businesses and emptied streets, she found herself increasingly worried about the dog she had come to think of as her stray. Though her boutique was closed to customers, Sarah still drove in 3 times a week to check inventory and process the occasional online order. Each time she brought extra food for the dog, but it wasn't enough. He was growing noticeably thinner, his once glossy coat becoming dull and patchy. "This isn't sustainable," she murmured one afternoon, watching from her car as the German Shepherd cautiously approached the bowl she'd left by the dumpster. "You need a real home, boy." Sarah had seen the missing dog posters years ago when she still lived in the countryside near the Marshalls. She remembered the family's heartbreak when their dog disappeared, especially the quiet boy who had seemed so attached to the animal. At the time, she hadn't made the connection between their lost pet and the stray who appeared in town months later. But now, studying the distinctive white star-shaped patch on the dog's chest, she wondered, could it be the same dog after all this time? The Marshalls lived a good 10 miles away, and it had been over 2 years. Surely they had given up hope by now. After much deliberation, Sarah made a call to the Washington County Johnson City Animal Shelter. She explained the situation: a long-term stray German Shepherd who was facing hardship with the pandemic closures. What she didn't mention was her suspicion about his origins. That seemed too far-fetched to share with strangers, especially when she had no proof beyond a vague memory and a similar marking. "We can send someone out," Tammy Davis, the shelter director, assured her, "but I should warn you, if he's been on the streets that long, he might be difficult to catch, and given his age and likely condition, plus the current situation with COVID, well, we'll do our best by him, but I can't make any promises about adoption." The unspoken implication hung heavily in the air. Dogs that couldn't be rehabilitated or adopted sometimes faced euthanasia, especially during crisis periods when resources were stretched thin. Sarah felt a stab of guilt. Was she potentially sending him to his death in an attempt to save him? 2 days later, an animal control van pulled into the empty parking lot of the business complex. Sarah watched from her boutique window as 2 officers equipped with catch poles and treats attempted to approach the German Shepherd. As she had feared, the dog was too street-smart, too wary of humans with equipment. He vanished between buildings before they could get close. "He's been avoiding people for years," Sarah explained when the frustrated officers returned, empty-handed. "You won't catch him that way." The next day they returned with a humane trap, a large metal cage with a pressure plate that would trigger the door to close when the dog entered to retrieve food. Sarah helped them set it up in the dog's favorite sheltered spot, and they baited it with fragrant roasted chicken. For 2 days nothing happened. The chicken spoiled and was replaced. Then, on the third morning, Sarah arrived to find the trap sprung and a pair of resigned amber eyes watching her approach. "I know you think I've betrayed you," she told the captured dog, whose body language radiated defeat rather than aggression, "but I'm trying to help you, I promise." Within an hour, the German Shepherd was processed into the Washington County Johnson City Animal Shelter. He was severely underweight with evidence of old injuries, including a badly healed gash on his flank, a notch missing from one ear, and several small scars across his muzzle. The veterinarian who examined him estimated his age at around 6 years and expressed surprise that an animal with his history of obvious trauma wasn't more aggressive. "Usually dogs that have been through what he has don't trust anybody," the vet told Tammy. "This one's just shut down. It's like he's given up." They named him Roscoe, vaccinated him, treated him for parasites, and settled him into a kennel in the adoption wing. The staff braced themselves for the usual period of adjustment: barking, anxiety, potential aggression. Instead, they got something more unsettling: nothing. Roscoe simply existed, a quiet ghost of a dog who accepted their care without resistance or gratitude. "It's the strangest thing," John Wilkins, one of the senior animal care specialists, commented after 2 weeks of attempting to engage with Roscoe. "He's not scared of us. He's not angry. He takes the food gently, never growls or snaps. He'll even let me put a leash on him for walks. But there's just nothing there. No tail wags, no excitement, no signs of stress either. It's like working with a stuffed animal." Maria Rodriguez, the shelter's behaviorist, spent hours with Roscoe, trying every trick in her considerable arsenal to draw him out. She brought in toys, offered high-value treats, used clickers and play bows, and even recordings of other dogs playing happily. Roscoe observed it all with the same detached politeness, occasionally accepting a treat but showing no particular enthusiasm or interest. "In some ways, this is harder than aggression," Maria explained during a staff meeting. "With an aggressive dog, at least there's something to work with, fear or territoriality that can be redirected. With Roscoe, it's like he's just waiting, but for what, I don't know." As weeks stretched into months, Roscoe became a fixture at the shelter. Other dogs came and went, adopted into new homes, or, in some cases, reunited with owners looking for lost pets. The pandemic had created an unusual situation. More people were adopting companion animals during lockdown, but simultaneously, economic hardship was forcing some families to surrender beloved pets they could no longer afford to keep. Through it all, Roscoe remained. He accepted the chaotic shelter environment with the same passive resignation he showed toward everything else. He never fought with other dogs, never showed excitement when potential adopters walked through, never demonstrated the sparkle of personality that often caught a visitor's eye and led to adoption. "We can't keep him forever," Tammy admitted after Roscoe had been there for 5 months. "Our resources are stretched thin as it is, and he's taking up space that could go to a dog with better adoption prospects." The unspoken question hung over the staff. Was it fair to keep him in this half-life, this existence without joy or connection? Was euthanasia perhaps the more humane option for a dog who seemed to have lost whatever made him want to engage with the world? "Give me 2 more weeks," Maria pleaded. "Let me try one more approach with him, and if there's still no improvement, we can discuss other options." Maria's new strategy was simple: less, not more. Instead of trying to draw Roscoe out with activities and stimulation, she simply sat in his kennel for 30 minutes each day, reading a book, not looking at him or asking anything of him. On the 3rd day of this new approach, something small but significant happened. Roscoe moved from his corner to lie down slightly closer to where she sat. "It's not much," Maria reported, "but it's the first voluntary interaction he's initiated. I think he might be more comfortable with quiet companionship than active engagement." This tiny breakthrough bought Roscoe more time, but the fundamental problem remained. Even if he was gradually becoming more comfortable, he showed none of the typical behaviors that made dogs adoptable. He didn't run to greet visitors, didn't play with toys, didn't demonstrate the kind of personality that made potential adopters fall in love. As Roscoe's 6-month anniversary at the shelter approached, Tammy made a difficult decision. The shelter couldn't keep him indefinitely, but perhaps someone in the wider community would be willing to take on a dog who might never be affectionate, but was at least well-behaved. She decided to make a special social media post about him, hoping against hope that somewhere out there was a person who would understand and accept Roscoe exactly as he was. Late one night, after the shelter had closed, Tammy sat at her computer crafting the post. She decided brutal honesty was the only approach that might work. "This is Roscoe. He's been with us for 6 months, and in that time he hasn't formed an attachment to any of our staff. He's approximately 6 years old, well-behaved, and non-aggressive with people and other animals. Roscoe will politely take treats from your hand, but then quickly move away. We believe he spent most of his life as a stray before coming to us. Roscoe would not be a good choice if you're looking for a cuddly companion or an enthusiastic greeter. He needs a quiet home with someone who understands that he may never be the typical loving pet. He deserves a chance at life outside these kennel walls, even if he never shows gratitude for it." She attached the best photo they had of him, a dignified profile shot that captured his handsome features and those profound, empty eyes. Then, with expectations firmly in check, she posted it to the shelter's Facebook page and went home for the night. The next morning, Tammy arrived at work to find that Roscoe's post had gone viral overnight. Something about his story, perhaps the unvarnished honesty of it, perhaps the sadness in his eyes, had struck a chord. The post had been shared over 5,000 times with hundreds of comments. Most were expressions of sympathy or questions about his background, but a few seemed to be genuine adoption inquiries. "I've printed out the most promising responses," John told her, handing over a small stack of papers. "There's a retired couple in Kentucky who specialize in rehabilitating traumatized dogs, and a woman in North Carolina with a farm sanctuary for special needs animals. They both seem willing to take him, knowing he might never become affectionate." Tammy began reviewing the applications with cautious optimism. Maybe there was hope for Roscoe after all. She was halfway through the stack when Maria burst into her office waving her phone with unusual excitement. "You need to see this message that just came through on our page," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Someone thinks Roscoe is their long-lost dog." Tammy took the phone, skepticism immediately rising. This wasn't the first time someone had claimed a shelter animal was their lost pet, usually based on nothing more than a passing resemblance to a dog that had been missing for a few months. But as she read the message, her doubt gave way to wonder. The message was from Linda Marshall, who explained that her family's German Shepherd, Runt, had disappeared over 3 years ago from their farm in Tennessee. She described the distinctive white star-shaped patch on his chest, the small notch in his left ear from a barbed wire injury as a puppy, and several other identifying characteristics that hadn't been visible in the Facebook photos but exactly matched Roscoe's features. Most compelling was the photo she attached. A happy German Shepherd with a young boy, both of them beaming at the camera in a way that made the contrast with the current somber Roscoe all the more heartbreaking. The marking on the chest was identical, down to the irregular edges of the white star. "This could actually be legitimate," Tammy murmured, studying the photo closely. "But after 3 years? And look how different his expression is in this picture. He looks like a completely different dog emotionally." "Should we contact them?" Maria asked. Tammy hesitated. The Marshall family farm was indeed about 10 miles from where Roscoe had been living as a stray, which made their story plausible. But reuniting a dog with former owners after such a long separation was fraught with potential complications. What if they were disappointed? What if Roscoe, or Runt if that was indeed his name, didn't recognize them? What if the trauma he had clearly experienced had permanently changed him in ways his former family couldn't accept? "Let me talk to the rest of the staff first," Tammy decided. "If this is really their dog, they've surely been grieving him for years. I don't want to get their hopes up if our behavioral team thinks he's too damaged to remember them." That afternoon, Tammy convened an emergency meeting with the senior staff, John, Maria, and Dr. Peterson, their veterinarian. They reviewed Linda Marshall's message and the accompanying photos, comparing them meticulously with their records of Roscoe. "The physical markings are certainly compelling," Dr. Peterson acknowledged. "The star on the chest, the notch in the ear, those are distinctive enough to be more than coincidence. And the general size and structure match what we'd expect for a dog of the age she describes." "But mentally, he's nothing like the dog in these pictures," John countered. "Look at him here. Alert, engaged, happy. Our Roscoe hasn't shown a flicker of that kind of spirit in the 6 months we've had him." "Trauma changes animals just like it changes people," Maria pointed out. 3 years is a long time, and who knows what he went through during that period. The scars we found suggest at least some abuse." The debate continued for nearly an hour. Finally, Tammy made her decision. "I respond to Mrs. Marshall and ask for more identifying details, things that wouldn't be obvious from looking at him, like specific commands he knew or behaviors unique to him. If those check out, we'll invite him to come identify him in person." She paused, looking around at her team. "But I want us all to be clear. We're not promising them their dog back yet. If he doesn't recognize them, or if we determine that returning to them wouldn't be in his best interest, we need to be prepared to make a difficult call." Linda Marshall's reply came within minutes, as if she had been anxiously waiting by her computer. She provided a detailed list. Runt knew how to open the refrigerator door, but was trained never to take food from it. He would always circle 3 times before lying down for the night. He had a unique way of greeting their son, Ethan, placing one paw precisely on the boy's right shoulder. He had been trained to bark once for yes and twice for no when asked simple questions. None of these behaviors had been observed in Roscoe during his time at the shelter, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. A dog in trauma often suppressed trained behaviors or habits associated with his previous life. "I think we have to let them come," Maria said after reading the list, "even if it's just to give them some closure." Tammy agreed and sent a response inviting the Marshall family to visit the shelter the following day. She cautioned them that the dog they called Roscoe had experienced significant trauma and might not be the same animal they remembered, even if he was indeed their lost Runt. She suggested that only one family member come initially to minimize stress on the dog. That night the shelter staff left with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Could this sad, shut-down dog really be the joyful animal in those family photos? And if he was, would seeing his original family spark something in him that all their months of care and effort had failed to ignite? As Tammy turned out the lights in the main office, she paused by Roscoe's kennel. He was awake, sitting in his usual spot, those amber eyes revealing nothing of what might lie beneath the surface. "If you are Runt," she told him softly, "your family has never forgotten you. They've been looking for you all this time. I hope you remember them." For the first time since his arrival, she thought she saw something flicker in those eyes. Not quite emotion, but perhaps a shadow of attention, as if some deeply buried part of him had heard and understood her words. Robert Marshall arrived at the Washington County Johnson City Animal Shelter precisely at 10 the next morning. He was a weathered man in his early 50s with calloused hands and the measured movements of someone who worked the land for a living. Following Tammy's suggestion, he had come alone, though he admitted his wife and children were waiting anxiously in a motel just a few miles away. "I want to thank you for this opportunity," he told Tammy as she led him through the shelter's main area. His voice was steady, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his emotions. "My wife saw your post last night and nearly collapsed. We've been looking for Runt for so long that, well, we'd almost given up hope." "I understand." Tammy replied carefully. "But I need to prepare you, Mr. Marshall. The dog we call Roscoe has been through a lot. He's physically healthy now, but emotionally he's very shut down. Even if he is your dog, he may not be the same animal you remember." Robert nodded, his jaw tightening. "Linda, my wife, she explained what you said on the phone about him being traumatized. We're prepared for that. We just need to know if it's him." They reached the door to the meet-and-greet room, where John had already settled Roscoe. The German shepherd sat politely in the center of the room, showing neither interest nor anxiety about this break in his routine. His eyes, as always, seemed focused on something distant and unreachable. "Take your time," Tammy advised, opening the door. "I'll be right outside if you need me." Robert stepped into the room, and for a long moment he simply stood there, studying the dog. Roscoe looked back at him with his characteristic detachment, showing no sign of recognition. "Runt," Robert finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is that you, boy?" The dog's ears twitched slightly at the sound, but otherwise he remained still. Robert slowly knelt down, extending his hand, palm up, the way one might approach any unfamiliar dog. "It's me, boy. It's Robert. You remember me, don't you?" Roscoe sniffed the offered hand with polite disinterest, then looked away. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Outside the door, Tammy felt her heart sink. She had seen this kind of non-reaction before. A dog too damaged to reconnect with its past. Robert's shoulders slumped, but he didn't give up. He reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a weathered leather collar with a tarnished name tag. "This was yours," he said, holding it where the dog could smell it. "You wore it every day for 3 years." Roscoe gave the collar a cursory sniff, but showed no more interest in it than he had in Robert himself. The man's composure began to crack, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You used to sleep at the foot of Ethan's bed. You would herd the chickens back to their coop without being asked. Every evening you'd wait on the east corner of the porch for Ethan to come home." He was rambling now, desperately searching for some detail that might break through. "You were terrified of thunderstorms. You'd hide under the kitchen table and wouldn't come out until the last rumble was gone." Nothing registered in the dog's impassive gaze. Finally Robert sank fully to his knees, the collar clutched tightly in his hand. "Please," he whispered, "please remember, Ethan hasn't spoken more than a dozen words since you left. Emma still looks for you every day. Linda—" His voice broke. "Linda still calls your name every night before she locks up, just in case you're out there trying to find your way home." Outside the door, Tammy closed her eyes. She had facilitated hundreds of adoptions and dozens of reunions in her career, but there was something uniquely painful about watching this man plead with a dog who showed no sign of remembering him. Inside the room, Robert wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, though it wasn't clear whether he was addressing Tammy, the dog, or himself. I was so sure when we saw that mark on his chest." He stood slowly, turning toward the door, defeat evident in every line of his body. Behind him, Roscoe remained seated, watching him go with the same dispassionate gaze he turned on everyone. But then something happened, a moment so small it might have been missed if not for its context. As Robert reached for the door handle, Roscoe tilted his head slightly, a barely perceptible change in his posture. His nostrils flared, taking in the man's scent more deeply. Robert didn't notice. His hand was on the doorknob when a sound stopped him. A soft, almost inaudible whine, like a rusty hinge being moved for the first time in years. He turned back. Roscoe was still seated in the center of the room, but his eyes had changed. There was a focus there now, an intensity that had been absent before. He was looking directly at Robert, really seeing him, perhaps for the first time. "Ryan," Robert said again, barely daring to hope. The dog stood, his movements stiff and uncertain. He took one halting step forward, then another. Robert knelt again, scarcely breathing. Outside the door, Tammy watched through the window, her hand pressed to her mouth. In her 6 months with this dog, she had never seen him approach anyone voluntarily. Roscoe, or Runt, moved slowly across the room, each step seeming to require immense effort, as if he were wading through invisible mud. When he reached Robert, he extended his nose, inhaling deeply. The man remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile connection was forming. For a long, suspended moment, nothing else happened. Then, with aching gentleness, the dog pressed his forehead against Robert's chest. It wasn't the ecstatic reunion of movies, no leaping, no licking, no exuberant display of joy. Just this, a dog who had forgotten how to express emotion, finding the simplest way to say, "I know you." Robert's composure shattered. He wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. "It's you," he sobbed. "It's really you." Tammy wiped away tears of her own before opening the door. "Mr. Marshall? Is everything okay?" Robert looked up, his face streaked with tears but transformed by joy. "It's him. It's Runt. He remembers me." The news spread rapidly through the shelter. Staff members who had known Roscoe as nothing but a polite automaton gathered at the door, watching in amazement as the dog leaned against Robert's leg, maintaining physical contact as if afraid the man might disappear. "I think we should proceed carefully," Tammy advised, professional caution tempering her own emotional response to the scene. "This is a positive sign, but he's still very shut down compared to what you've described from before. We might want to arrange a few more visits before—" She was interrupted by the shelter's front door flying open. A woman burst in, followed by 2 children, a teenage boy and a younger girl. Despite Tammy's suggestion that only Robert come for the initial visit, the rest of the Marshall family had apparently been unable to contain their hope and curiosity. "We couldn't wait in the motel," Linda Marshall explained breathlessly. "Not when Robert texted that it might really be him. Is it true? Is it Runt?" Before Tammy could answer, the family caught sight of the scene through the meet-and-greet room window. Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Emma, the little girl, let out a squeal of delight. But it was Ethan, the teenage boy, whose reaction was most striking. His face, previously guarded and expressionless, suddenly blazed with an emotion too complex to name. "Wait," Tammy began, concerned about overwhelming the fragile dog with too many people too quickly. "We should take this slowly." But her warning came too late. Ethan pushed past her and flung open the door to the meet-and-greet room. "Runt!" he cried, the first word he had spoken aloud in months. The effect on the dog was electric. His head snapped up, ears fully erect for the first time since he'd arrived at the shelter. He stared at Ethan with an intensity that seemed to vibrate in the air. Time suspended as dog and boy regarded each other across the room. Then, in a movement so fluid it made mockery of his previous stiffness, Runt crossed the distance between them and rose up to place his right paw precisely on Ethan's right shoulder. It was one of the identifying behaviors Linda had described in her email, a greeting unique to boy and dog, a gesture untainted by the intervening years of separation and trauma. Ethan's composure crumbled. He threw his arms around Runt's neck, his thin shoulders shaking with sobs. And then, most miraculous of all, Runt's tail began to move. Not the full, joyous wagging of a carefree dog, but a tentative swaying, like a rusty weather vane creaking back to life after years of stillness. Linda and Emma joined the reunion, the 4 of them forming a tight huddle on the floor of the meet-and-greet room. Robert looked up at Tammy, his face awash with gratitude. "Thank you," he mouthed silently over his family's heads. But the reunion, powerful as it was, raised as many questions as it answered. As the initial wave of emotion ebbed, practical considerations resurfaced. "I hate to interrupt," Tammy said gently, "but we have some details to work out. Runt, has been through significant trauma. His recovery isn't going to happen overnight." "We understand that," Linda said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "We're prepared to give him whatever time and space he needs." "There's something else you should know," Tammy continued reluctantly. "Your post wasn't the only response we received to our social media appeal. We have another family very interested in adopting him, a couple named James and Victoria Anderson. They have resources specifically for rehabilitating traumatized dogs." A sudden tension filled the room. "But he's our dog," Emma protested, her young voice fierce with indignation. "You can't give him to someone else." "Of course not, honey," Tammy reassured her quickly. "But it's my responsibility to make sure that wherever Runt goes, it's truly what's best for him. The Andersons have a large estate with professional animal therapists on staff. They've successfully rehabilitated many traumatized dogs." "Are you saying we can't provide what he needs?" Robert asked, his voice carefully controlled. Tammy hesitated. "I'm saying we need to consider all factors. Runt clearly remembers you, which is remarkable after so long. But memory isn't everything. His emotional state is extremely fragile. He'll need specialized care to recover from whatever he experienced during those missing years." "We'll get him whatever help he needs," Linda insisted. "We're not the same family we were 3 years ago, either. Losing him changed us. We've learned about trauma, too." She looked pointedly at Ethan, who was still silently huddled against Runt's side. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Maria, who had been observing from a distance. "If I may," she said, addressing both Tammy and the Marshalls, "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Reunions like this are emotionally overwhelming for everyone, including the dog. What I'd suggest is that we arrange for a series of visits over the next week. This will give Runt time to reacclimate to his family in a controlled environment, and it will give us time to assess how he's responding." Tammy nodded, grateful for her colleague's balanced approach. "That seems reasonable. Would that work for your family, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall?" The Marshalls exchanged looks. "We've taken a room locally," Robert said. "We can stay as long as needed." "But what about these other people? The Andersons? What if they try to claim him while we're going through this process?" "I'll explain the situation to them," Tammy promised. "No decisions will be made until we're certain of what's best for Runt." As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for the Marshalls to return the following day, Tammy couldn't help but notice one remarkable detail. Throughout the entire conversation, Runt had not moved from Ethan's side, maintaining constant physical contact with the boy who had once been his closest companion. It was the strongest evidence yet that beneath the trauma and detachment, the dog they had known as Roscoe was indeed finding his way back to being Runt. The week that followed was filled with equal measures of hope and heartbreak for the Marshall family. Each day they came to the shelter for supervised visits with Runt, and each day revealed new layers of both progress and damage. The dog remembered them. That much was beyond question now. But remembering wasn't the same as healing. "It's like he's caught between two worlds," Linda confided to Maria after their third visit. They were watching through the window as Ethan sat quietly beside Runt in the shelter's small exercise yard. The boy was reading aloud from a dog-eared paperback, something he had apparently done often before Runt's disappearance. The German shepherd lay with his head on his paws, eyes fixed attentively on Ethan's face. "That's actually a very insightful way to put it," Maria agreed. "He remembers who he was with your family, but he can't forget what happened afterward. The trauma is still very much with him." Over the course of that week, Maria had been conducting gentle exercises to assess Runt's psychological state. What she discovered painted a grim picture of his missing years. He showed all the classic signs of having been used in dogfighting, not as a fighter himself, but as what industry professionals grimly termed a bait dog. The evidence was there in his reactions, the way he flinched at sudden movements, how he cowered when near certain types of men, his habit of turning his body sideways to make himself a smaller target when approached. Most telling were the scars that Dr. Peterson had documented in his initial examination. During a careful reassessment, the veterinarian pointed out patterns consistent with attack wounds, healed punctures and tears that told a story of repeated abuse. The notch in his ear, which the marshals had attributed to a puppyhood accident with barbed wire, had actually been torn further, suggesting someone had grabbed him roughly and repeatedly by that vulnerable appendage. I don't understand how anyone could do this to him," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion as Dr. Peterson explained his findings. "He's the gentlest dog I've ever known." "That's precisely why he would have been targeted," the vet explained grimly. "Dogfighting operations look for exactly that quality in their bait animals. Dogs who won't fight back, who will simply endure. It makes the fighting dogs feel more powerful, builds their confidence." The knowledge of what Runt had suffered was devastating to the Marshall family. Emma, at 8, was too young to fully comprehend the cruelty involved, but she understood enough to weep bitterly when she overheard the adults talking. Ethan, who had begun speaking again in short, halting sentences since their reunion with Runt, retreated once more into watchful silence. Linda found herself waking in the middle of the night, plagued by imagined scenes of her beloved pet's suffering. "If only we'd looked harder," she would whisper to Robert in the darkness of their motel room. "If only we'd gone farther, searched longer." "We did everything we could," he would remind her, though his own guilt was etched deeply in the new lines around his eyes. "We put up posters for miles. We called every shelter in 3 counties. We never stopped looking." What neither of them said aloud was that their search, extensive as it had been, had never extended as far as the ramshackle property where Runt had been held captive, nor to the commercial district where he had later lived as a stray. The simple truth was that 10 miles might as well have been 1,000 when searching for a lost dog in rural Tennessee. They had looked in all the places they thought he might reasonably have gone, but reason had nothing to do with what had actually happened to him. As painful as these revelations were, there were moments of hope as well. Each day Runt showed small but significant signs of remembering his former self. On the 4th day, when Emma brought his old tennis ball, preserved all these years in a shoebox under her bed, Runt's ears perked up with genuine interest for the first time. He didn't chase the ball when she rolled it across the floor, but he watched its movement with a focus that hadn't been present before. On the 5th day, when Linda brought a blanket from home that still carried the familiar scents of the farm, Runt buried his nose in it for long minutes, his body relaxing visibly as he inhaled the remembered smells. For a brief moment, his tail gave a few tentative wags, not the enthusiastic sweep of his younger days, but a definite expression of contentment. Most significant was his continuing bond with Ethan. Though the boy had stopped speaking again after learning of Runt's abuse, he communicated with the dog through touch and presence in a way that seemed to transcend words. He would sit for hours with one hand resting lightly on Runt's back, both of them seemingly content with this simple connection. During these quiet moments, shelter staff observed subtle changes in Runt's demeanor. His breathing would deepen, the constant vigilance in his eyes would soften, and occasionally, almost imperceptibly, he would lean into the boy's touch. "There's definitely a foundation to build on here," Maria told Tammy after observing one such session. "The bond is still there, damaged, yes, but not destroyed." While the Marshall family worked to reconnect with their long-lost pet, another drama was unfolding behind the scenes at the shelter. James and Victoria Anderson, the wealthy couple who had expressed interest in adopting Roscoe before the Marshalls identified him, were not quietly withdrawing their application as Tammy had hoped. "I understand the sentimental aspects of this situation," James Anderson said during a tense phone call with Tammy on the 6th day, "but my wife and I are prepared to provide specialized care that frankly a farming family simply cannot match. We have 2 full-time animal behaviorists on staff at our estate. We've successfully rehabilitated dogs from far worse situations." "Mr. Anderson, I appreciate your concern and your generous offer," Tammy replied carefully. "But this isn't simply about who can provide better resources. Runt," that's his real name, "has clearly recognized his original family. That kind of emotional connection can't be measured in dollars and cents. With all due respect, Miss Davis, emotion shouldn't be the determining factor here. This is about what's best for the animal's recovery. My understanding is that he suffered severe trauma during his years away from this family. Doesn't that suggest they failed in their duty of care in the first place?" The accusation stung, partly because Tammy had harbored similar thoughts herself in her most pragmatic moments. The Marshalls were good people who clearly loved their dog, but love alone couldn't heal the kind of psychological damage Runt had endured. "The circumstances of his disappearance were beyond their control," she said firmly, "and as for his recovery, we're still assessing the situation. No decisions have been made yet." "I see." Anderson's tone cooled noticeably. "Then perhaps I should mention that my wife and I made a substantial donation to your shelter last year. I would hate to think that our continued support might be contingent on the outcome of this particular case, but these are difficult financial times for everyone, aren't they?" The implied threat was clear. The Andersons' donation had indeed been substantial, enough to fund crucial renovations to the shelter's aging facilities. In the current economic climate, with pandemic budget cuts already straining their resources, losing such generous benefactors would be a significant blow. "I'll take your concerns under advisement, Mr. Anderson," Tammy said, keeping her voice neutral with effort. "But I should warn you that attempting to influence our decision through financial pressure would be highly inappropriate." After ending the call, Tammy sat at her desk for a long time, weighing her obligations to the shelter and its many animals who benefited from donors like the Andersons, to Runt, whose best interests were her professional responsibility to determine, to the Marshall family, whose grief and hope were painfully genuine. The right path forward wasn't as clear as she had initially thought. When she finally left her office to check on Runt's afternoon session with the Marshalls, she found a scene that complicated her deliberations even further. The entire family was sitting on the floor of the exercise yard, forming a close circle around Runt. For the first time since he had arrived at the shelter 6 months ago, the German Shepherd was lying on his side, his body language completely relaxed, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. Emma was gently stroking his ears, while Ethan sat cross-legged with Runt's head resting on his knee. It was a picture of family healing, beautiful, poignant, and utterly at odds with the practical considerations that Tammy knew she couldn't ignore. The morning of the final decision dawned gray and drizzly, a fitting backdrop for the weight Tammy felt as she drove to the shelter. After a week of observation, consultation with her staff, and careful consideration of all factors, she had scheduled a meeting with both the Marshalls and the Andersons to announce her recommendation regarding Runt's future. She had barely slept the night before, turning the problem over and over in her mind. The Andersons had every advantage on paper: financial resources, professional support staff, a sprawling estate where Runt would want for nothing materially. They had even submitted an impressive rehabilitation plan, complete with timelines and methodologies specifically tailored to dogs recovering from abuse. The Marshalls, by contrast, had only their history with Runt and their obvious love for him. Their farm was modest, their resources limited. They could not afford specialized behaviorists or custom-built facilities. What they offered was simpler: familiarity, connection, the comfort of returning to a place where Runt had once been happy. Was that enough? Tammy wasn't sure. But she had made her decision, and now she would have to stand by it. The Andersons arrived first, 15 minutes early for the 10 a.m. meeting. James Anderson was a tall, imposing man in his 60s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. His wife, Victoria, was younger, perhaps in her late 40s, elegantly dressed despite the early hour and inclement weather. "We appreciate you taking our application seriously," James said as they settled into the chairs in Tammy's small office. "I know this has been a complicated situation." "Yes, it has," Tammy agreed, noting with some anxiety that the marshals had not yet arrived. It was already 9:58. At precisely 10 a.m., there was a knock at the office door. John Wilkins poked his head in, his expression uncharacteristically tense. "Tammy, we have a situation. The marshals are here, but, well, you need to come see." Confused, Tammy excused herself and followed John to the shelter's main reception area. There she found Linda and Robert Marshall, along with Emma, who was clutching a worn stuffed animal that looked like it had seen better days. But Ethan was not with them. "Where's your son?" Tammy asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. Linda's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. "He wouldn't come," she said quietly. "He hasn't spoken a word since yesterday, and this morning he locked himself in his room. He left this note." She handed Tammy a folded piece of paper. In a child's careful handwriting were the words, "If Runt can't come home, I don't want to say goodbye. It will hurt him too much." Tammy felt her carefully constructed decision begin to crumble around the edges. She had considered all the practical factors, weighed all the evidence, consulted with experts. But she had perhaps underestimated the depth of the connection between boy and dog. "Mrs. Marshall, She was interrupted by Maria, who came hurrying from the direction of the kennels. "You need to see this," she said urgently. "It's Runt. He's been acting strangely all morning." Leaving the marshals in the reception area, Tammy followed Maria back to Runt's kennel, aware that this was quickly spiraling beyond her control. When they arrived at his enclosure, Tammy understood immediately what Maria meant by strange behavior. Runt was pacing in tight circles, his movements jerky and agitated. He would stop occasionally to stare at the door, then resume his circling with increased intensity. It was the most emotion he had displayed in his entire time at the shelter, with the exception of his reunion with the marshals. "He's been like this since we opened this morning," Maria explained. "At first I thought he was sick, but Dr. Peterson checked him out and found nothing physically wrong. Then I realized he knows something is happening. Dogs can sense when major changes are coming, and he's picking up on the tension." Tammy watched the distressed animal for a long moment. "Has he ever acted like this before?" "Never," Maria confirmed. "The only other time I've seen him show this much emotion was when he first recognized Ethan." "Ethan," Tammy repeated thoughtfully. "Who isn't here today?" She made a sudden decision. "Get the Andersons from my office and bring them here. And the marshals, too. I want everyone to see this." When all parties were assembled outside Runt's kennel, Tammy explained the situation. "As you can see, Runt is significantly agitated today. We believe he's sensing that a major decision is being made about his future." Victoria Anderson peered through the glass at the pacing dog. "Poor thing," she said with what sounded like genuine concern. "This only confirms our belief that he needs specialized care. This level of anxiety—" "With all due respect, Mrs. Anderson," Robert Marshall said, his voice tight, "you don't know our dog. This isn't just anxiety. He's looking for someone." "Looking for someone?" James Anderson repeated skeptically. "For Ethan," Linda explained. "Our son couldn't bear to come today. He and Runt have always had a special connection." As if on cue, the shelter's front door opened, and there stood Sarah Thompson, the woman who had reported Runt to animal control in the first place. She wasn't alone. Beside her, looking small and terrified, was Ethan Marshall. "I found him walking along the highway about a mile from here," Sarah explained breathlessly. "He said he had to come, but couldn't bear to ride with his parents. I recognized him from your Facebook photos and offered him a ride." Linda rushed to her son, enfolding him in a tight embrace. "Ethan, we were so worried. How did you get out of your room? Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" The boy didn't answer, his eyes fixed on Runt's kennel. For his part, the German Shepherd had frozen in mid-pace, his entire body alert, nose working furiously as he caught a familiar scent. "Ethan," Tammy said gently, "Runt has been very upset this morning. Would you be willing to go in and see him? It might calm him down." The boy nodded wordlessly. Maria unlocked the kennel door, and Ethan slipped inside. What happened next left everyone watching in stunned silence. Runt approached the boy slowly, almost reverently. There was no frantic greeting, no leaping or licking. Instead, the dog circled Ethan once, twice, then sat directly in front of him, looking up into his face with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. And then, in a voice rusty from disuse, but clear enough for everyone to hear through the glass, Ethan spoke to his dog. "I never stopped looking for you," he said simply. "Every day after school I would take my bike and ride a different road, calling your name. Even after Mom and Dad stopped putting up new posters, I kept looking." He knelt down, bringing his face level with Runt's. "I found one of your tennis balls in the creek last summer, all covered in mud. I cleaned it up and put it with your other things. I knew you were still out there somewhere." Tammy was aware of Linda Marshall stifling a sob beside her, of Robert's hand gripping his wife's shoulder tightly. Even the Andersons were watching in rapt attention, Victoria's expression softening noticeably. Inside the kennel, Ethan continued talking to Runt, his words flowing more freely now, as if a dam had broken. "I heard what happened to you, the bad men who hurt you. I'm so sorry we didn't find you in time, but you were brave, weren't you? You survived. You kept trying to get home." At this, Runt made a small, soft sound, not quite a whine, but a vocalization nonetheless. It was the first voluntary sound he had made since his initial reunion with the Marshalls a week ago. "And look," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket, "I brought this. I've carried it every day since you disappeared." He pulled out a tattered leather dog tag, the metal disc still attached but worn almost smooth. It was Runt's original identification tag, the one that had been on his collar the day he vanished. Seeing it, Runt did something extraordinary. He gently took the tag from Ethan's hand and held it in his mouth for a moment before setting it carefully on the floor between them. Sarah Thompson, who had been watching from a slight distance, suddenly stepped forward. "I knew it," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I knew there was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it." All eyes turned to her. "I used to live about a mile from your farm," she explained to the Marshalls. "I moved to town about 4 years ago, but I remember when you got that puppy. I remember the posters when he went missing, too. You were the one feeding him in town," Tammy realized. "The connection we were missing." Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. "For over 2 years. I never made the connection. He was so different, so shut down. But I knew there was something special about him, something familiar. That's why I couldn't just leave him when the pandemic hit." This revelation created a momentary silence, broken only by the soft sound of Ethan continuing to talk to Runt, the words too quiet now for the adults to hear. James Anderson cleared his throat. "Miss Davis, I think we've seen enough. My wife and I would like to withdraw our application." Tammy turned to him in surprise. "Mr. Anderson?" The man's usual commanding presence seemed diminished somehow as he watched the boy and dog together. "Some things are beyond price or professional care," he said simply. "Whatever that dog has been through, he never forgot that boy. And clearly the boy never forgot him either. That's where he belongs." Victoria nodded in agreement, her earlier poise cracking to reveal genuine emotion. "We wanted to help an animal in need, but this dog already has exactly what he needs to heal." Tammy felt a wave of relief wash over her. The decision that had seemed so complex, so fraught with conflicting responsibilities, had just become crystal clear. Inside the kennel, Ethan had his arms around Runt's neck, and the dog was leaning into the embrace, his eyes closed, his body finally fully relaxed. It wasn't the joyous reunion of storybooks. It was something deeper, quieter, a mutual recognition of shared pain and enduring connection. "Take your dog home, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall," Tammy said softly. "Take him home." The journey back to the Marshall farm was quiet, a peaceful kind of quiet that comes after storms have passed and skies have cleared. Robert drove steadily along the winding Tennessee roads, Linda beside him in the passenger seat. In the back, Emma had fallen asleep, her head resting against the window, while Ethan sat in the middle with Runt pressed against his side, the boy's hand buried in the dog's thick fur. They had spent one more night in the motel after signing all the necessary paperwork. Tammy had insisted on a final veterinary check and had sent them home with detailed instructions for Runt's continued care, recommendations for a trauma-informed veterinarian in their area, suggestions for creating safe spaces in their home, a list of potential triggers to avoid. "Remember, recovery isn't linear," she had told them during their final meeting. "There will be good days and bad days. He may never be exactly the dog you remember, but that doesn't mean he can't have a good life with you." As they turned onto the gravel drive that led to their farmhouse, Robert glanced in the rearview mirror. Runt had lifted his head, his ears perked forward, his nose working as he caught familiar scents through the partially opened window. "We're home, boy," Robert said softly. "We're finally home." The farmhouse looked just as it always had. Weathered white clapboard with a wide front porch, the old oak tree in the yard, the red barn in the distance. But to Runt, experiencing it again after 3 long years of hardship, it must have seemed like something from a dream. As Robert parked the truck, the German shepherd's entire body tensed, his eyes fixed on the house with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. They hadn't discussed how to handle this moment, whether to let Runt explore at his own pace or guide him through a reintroduction to his old home. In the end, nature made the decision for them. The minute Emma opened the car door, Runt slipped past her and out into the yard, where he stood motionless, taking in the sights and smells of the place he had once known so well. "Should we call him back?" Linda whispered anxiously. "No," Ethan said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "He needs to remember on his own." They watched as Runt moved cautiously across the yard, sniffing at the base of the oak tree, pausing by the garden gate, circling the perimeter of the house. His body language remained alert but not fearful, his movements purposeful rather than panicked. He was relearning his territory, peace. Then something remarkable happened. Runt moved to the eastern corner of the porch, the exact spot where he had kept his faithful watch for Ethan every day at 6:15. He sat down, assuming the precise position that had been his habit for so many years, and looked out across the fields toward the road. Emma gasped. "He remembers?" "Of course he does," Ethan said simply. "This is where he belongs." The first weeks of Runt's return were a delicate dance of rediscovery and healing. There were challenges, as Tammy had warned them to expect. Thunderstorms, once merely a source of anxiety for him, now triggered episodes of intense fear that sent him hiding in the darkest corners of the house. Certain sounds, a car backfiring, metal striking metal, would cause him to cower and tremble. He was wary of strangers, especially men with loud voices, and would position himself between them and Ethan, his body tense with protective vigilance. But there were triumphs, too, small moments of the old Runt shining through. The first time he voluntarily brought his tennis ball to Robert, dropping it at his feet with a cautious expectancy. The morning Linda found him curled at the foot of Ethan's bed, just as he used to sleep before his disappearance. The day he barked, not in fear or warning, but with genuine excitement, when Emma called him for dinner. Word of Runt's return spread quickly through their rural community. Neighbors who had helped search for him years ago stopped by to witness the miracle for themselves. Former classmates of Ethan's, who remembered his heartbreak and subsequent silence, came to see the dog who had brought back his voice. Even Sarah Thompson drove out from town one Sunday afternoon, bringing with her the metal bowl she had used to feed him during his years as a stray. "I think he might want this as a souvenir," she said, with a smile, handing the dented dish to Ethan. A reminder that even in the darkest times there was someone looking out for him. The marshals kept in touch with the shelter staff, sending photos and updates on Runt's progress. Tammy Davis used their story in a presentation at a National Animal Welfare Conference, highlighting the remarkable resilience of the bond between humans and their animal companions. The Andersons, true to their word, continued their financial support of the shelter, even funding a new program specifically designed to reunite lost pets with their family. As summer faded into fall and fall gave way to winter, Runt's healing continued. He would never be exactly the same dog who had chased the fox into the woods 3 years earlier. Too much had happened, too many scars had formed, both visible and invisible. But in many ways he became something even more remarkable, a testament to survival, to the enduring power of connection, to the possibility of finding joy even after profound suffering. One crisp December evening, a year after Runt's return, Linda stood at the kitchen window, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift down in the glow of the porch light. In the yard, bundled against the cold, Ethan was throwing a frisbee for Runt, their breath-making clouds in the frosty air. The German Shepherd leapt and twisted, catching the disc in mid-air with a grace that belied his years and hardships. Linda felt Robert's arms encircle her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as he too watched the scene outside. "Look at 'em," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "Just look at 'em." Ethan was laughing, his face tipped up to the falling snow, more carefree than they had seen him in years. And Runt, their loyal, damaged, incredibly resilient Runt, was racing in joyful circles around the boy, his tail held high, his movements uninhibited by memory or fear. In that moment, against all odds, they were simply a boy and his dog, playing in the season's first snow. Home at last. The story of Runt reminds us that it's never too late to find our way home again. For those of us who've weathered our own storms over the decades, losing jobs we thought would last forever, watching children move away, saying goodbye to old friends, Runt's journey speaks to something profound in our hearts. Remember how it felt when you first brought home your family dog, perhaps for your children who are now grown with families of their own. Remember the unconditional love that saw you through your toughest days. Like Runt, we too bear scars from life's unexpected turns, but we still recognize the things that matter most. We understand what it means to endure, to carry on when giving up seems easier. We know that reunion with what we've lost might not look like we imagined, but can be deeper, more meaningful for the journey taken. When Runt finally returned to that eastern corner of the porch, he wasn't the same dog who left, just as we aren't the same people we were in our youth. But he remembered what mattered. And isn't that the greatest victory of all? To come home changed, yet still recognize what love looks like and be recognized in return. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.